And the Washington folks are downstairs. You're here, up there. Quiet, Washington, raise your hand. And we have some superb homeschoolers. Raise your hand. Perfect. And the biggest question is, anybody here read Hana's Suitcase? All right. Okay. Because you're going to learn more about it today. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Greg Peterson. I am the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and the Robert H. Jackson Center is just pleased to have you join us, as well as a number of schools who are be enjoying this over the long-distance broadcasting, and for that we're thrilled. So you're part of a very large audience throughout New York State today. This is the concluding event of 2 days worth of activities here at the Robert H. Jackson Center, all surrounding the book Hana's Suitcase, authored by Karen Levine, who will be introduced shortly. Part and parcel of this has been an essay contest for 5th through 8th grade students who were invited to participate in that essay on Hana's Suitcase or a similar book about the Holocaust with the theme, how does the story you have read help you to better understand how intolerance and racism can result in violation of people's civil and human rights? There were 7 winners throughout New York State, and they were honored last night at the Robert Jackson Center. I'm going to briefly mention them because you may know them. One of them is John Todd. He's from Southwestern School. Samantha Calla from the St. Joseph School in Batavia, New York. Brianna Gibson, Forestville, also goes to, his hometown is in Fredonia. Daniel Tapia, and he's from the Eastport South Manor Junior Senior High in Suffolk County. Juliana Blackburn Baskin, she's from Batavia. Joanna Choinska, who was from Queens County. And Gabriella Garver from Faulkner, New York, in Chautauqua County. So throughout the state, there were 3 Chautauqua County winners. And we appreciate all the participation of everybody in the essay contest, and certainly the participation here. We were privileged to have this event through the graciousness of a variety of sponsors. I'm going to read them quickly. The New York State Bar Association, the New York State Bar Foundation, SKF, Aeromart and Yaw Oil, Campbell and Shelton Law Firm, Comfort Inn, Jamestown Savings Bank, the Carl Peterson Fund and the Lynn Foundation Fund, the Lyle Peterson Memorial Fund, the National Fuel Gas, Price Abstract Company, Roe Henderson Agency, Roberto's Restaurant, the Legend Group, and the Weinberg Financial Group. We thank them all. Let's give them just a hand because they made it possible. What's going to happen today is that I will be shortly introducing Anita Sanctuary, who is the quarterback, and for all of you teachers, you know her well because she's the one that masterminded this and has worked on this for well over a year. And this doesn't happen without Anita Sanctuary. So I'll introduce her, who she in turn will introduce our special guest and author, Karen Levine, and then we'll conclude with a wonderful guest, Annalise Salomon, who'll give you a story, and if time permits, a Q&A after that. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce and publicly thank, for everything she's done for us, Anita Sanctuary.
Welcome schools, welcome school children. It's a beautiful day for a program. We are together today because of a powerful story written by talented and honored author Karen Levine. She has dedicated her life to issues of social justice, and Hana's Suitcase, along with her work in radio broadcasting, reflects her mission to achieve fairness throughout the world. Ms. Levine won the prestigious Florence Burt Award for her work to increase awareness of women's rights. Hana's Suitcase, her multi-award winning book, is published in over 40 countries and is now a touring stage play in the United States and in Japan. In addition, 2 films are currently being developed to tell about Hana and the issues of racism experienced by her family. This touching story of a young Jewish girl even was awarded the Children's Book of the Year by Yad Vashem, the most prestigious Holocaust museum in the world. We are anxious to hear Karen Levine's message, so please welcome this remarkable woman.
Thank you very much, Greg and Anita, for the introduction and all the hard work you did in making today possible, and to all the good people at the Robert Jackson Center and to everybody here today. When I first wrote Hana's Suitcase, more than 6 years ago now, I never dreamed that so many people in so many countries would respond in the way they have to this story. I've been all over the world with it, to Australia and Japan and Germany and Italy and France and England and all over the States and Canada. And none of us involved in this story, not George and not Fumiko and certainly not me, had a clue that things would turn out this way, or that all our lives would be so dramatically changed by it. And I should add that I've spoken in many, many places, in many, many countries, but I think the center I spoke in this morning, the Reg Linné Civic Center Theater, was about the single most beautiful space I've ever managed to be in, so that was great. Hana's Suitcase is a story that reaches over 70 years of history, 3 generations, and 3 continents. It's the story, first and foremost, of course, of a girl named Hana Brady, who was born on May 16, 1931, in Novo Město, Czechoslovakia, and died in a gas chamber at Auschwitz at the age of 13. It's also the story of Fumiko Ishioka, a remarkable young Japanese woman who was so dedicated to sharing Hana's story with kids in Japan that she spent almost a year searching the world for it. And it's also the story of George Brady, Hana's brother. And it all came together because of that plain old dumpy suitcase. My own interest in the Holocaust began when I was quite young, just before I was a teenager. I grew up in the capital of Canada, which is, thank you. And on Sunday mornings, I used to have to go to Jewish school, and often I was very grumbly about having to go to Jewish school, so my dad would take me after Jewish school to a delicatessen to get my favorite thing in the world, which was cinnamon bread. And this delicatessen was owned by the Kardish family, and Mrs. Kardish served us every Sunday morning. And she had a blue number on her arm, right here, on the inside of her forearm. And I don't remember anymore how I found out where she got the number, but I did find out that it was branded into her when she was in a concentration camp during the Second World War. I was never brave enough to ask her about it directly. I was just too shy. But every Sunday morning, I just couldn't stop staring at Mrs. Kardish's blue number. Then when I was 13 years old, my family went to Europe for the first time, and one of the places we visited was the Buchenwald concentration camp, another very large Nazi concentration camp in which tens of thousands of Jews were murdered. I didn't know it at the time, but that visit changed my whole life, because I've never ever forgotten what I saw in the museum there. It was a very sobering experience to be on that ground and see what I saw. There were piles of shoes and piles of eyeglasses and piles of canes and leg braces. There were even piles of human hair, and there were piles of suitcases. And from the minute I got back from that visit to Buchenwald, I was sort of obsessed with the history of the Holocaust, and I started to read absolutely anything I could get my hands on. Now, this was I was 13. It was 1968. The Holocaust was very little spoken of in adult company or with children. There were no books written specifically for children about the Holocaust. We certainly did not learn about the Holocaust in school. But I scrounged around and I found things to read. And I started then, and I'm still reading now. And I'm reading now for the same reasons that I began. I wanted to understand how it was possible, and I don't understand yet, which is one reason why I'm still reading. I wanted to understand how it was possible for such evil to have been allowed to happen in the world. I wanted to understand, too, how it was possible for people who survived the Holocaust, people like Annalise, who you're going to meet a little later, how it was possible for them even to put one foot in front of the other after living through what they lived through. And because I'm Jewish, I always had this funny feeling, and it's not actually funny, it's creepy, feeling that if I had been born in a different time or place, that could have been me, or my mom, or my dad, or my sister living through that experience, or much more likely, dying in it. So the Holocaust made me sad, but it also made me angry. There were 6 million Jews murdered, and millions of other people too. Gypsies, disabled people, people of color, gay people, communists. I wanted to do something about it, and I thought that if people only knew what had happened, then surely they would have to make sure that something like that would never happen again. So in my own way, at 13, I started to tell stories. In school, I went into high school, I wrote essays on the subject, I did the same in university. I went to work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is our public radio and television, as a radio producer in 1979, and I made some radio programs about it. And in 1989, actually, I made a 6-hour documentary series called Lost Innocence, The Children of World War II. This was to mark the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of the war. 1 hour was about children who were active in the anti-Nazi resistance as gun runners and couriers and decoys. There was 1 hour about teenage romance in wartime, and there was one about children in the Holocaust. And when I finished that series, I thought, I'm done with this. I'm never coming back to this part of history again. And that stayed true, at least in terms of my radio work, until December of 2000, when I read about the story of Hana's Suitcase in a community newspaper. And I still remember where I was sitting and what I was wearing when I first read the story. It just struck me to the core. I fell in love with this story the first time I read it. It's a very unusual Holocaust story. At the center of it is a terrible, terrible tragedy, because Hana was a great kid who was murdered when she was just 13 years old for one reason, and that was that she was born a Jew. And it's very important to remember that Hana was just one of 1.5 million Jewish children who died at the hands of the Nazis. But the story of Hana's Suitcase, thanks to Fumiko and thanks to George, had this whole other modern layer to it that was actually full of connection and hope, and there was a mystery. So I decided I wanted to try and make a radio documentary about this story. That's what I do in my work. I make radio documentaries. So that very night, I looked George Brady up in the Toronto phone book, And I took a deep breath and I called him up. And he was nice, lucky for me. And he said he'd be happy to talk to me. And he told me that Fumiko was about to arrive in Canada for the first time in just a couple of days. They were going to meet for the first time, and they were both really nervous. And George had all kinds of plans for showing Fumiko around Toronto and Canada. And he said as long as I didn't mess up their plans to see Niagara Falls, that they'd be happy to spend some time with me. So I spent a couple of hours with each of them separately, and I made a documentary called Hana's Suitcase, which aired on the program I work on, which is called the Sunday edition. And the second it was over on the radio, my phone rang, and it was a very dear friend of mine, Margie Wolf, and she was in tears. Margie is the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, and she also happens to be a book publisher. And she said to me, "You have to turn this story into a book for young readers." Well, I had never written a book before, and I'd never thought of writing a book before. I have a son who was then just 6 and a very demanding job, so I didn't take Margie very seriously. But like Fumiko, she's a little persistent, and so she didn't leave me alone, and the story didn't leave me alone. And so about 6 months later, I actually tried to get started. And I did get started. I started going into my office on weekend mornings to write. I spent a lot of time with George, usually over cups of hot tea, trying to help him dredge up every little shred of memory he could come up with about his sister. He wrote to people all over the world who had known Hana as a child, so we could fill in some of those parts of the story where George wasn't present. And Fumiko and I emailed back and forth, getting her side of the story straight. And George and I went through his amazing collection of photographs and artifacts. Most Holocaust survivors don't have many photographs and artifacts. Many have none. But George had Christian relatives who were able to hide all the Brady family photographs during the war, and so George has hundreds of them. Why isn't this moving? Where's Ed? Yes. So just hang on 1 second, because I want to show you. There. Beautiful. See, all we needed was Ed. The arrow. Yes. So that is just one of the very beautiful photographs that George has, obviously, of him and his mom and Hana. So I want to tell you a bit about Fumiko, her work, and how the story came together. That is the very tiny Tokyo Holocaust Education Resource Center. It was just a couple of rooms at the bottom of an apartment building in downtown Tokyo. Fumiko is the director of this center. She's the director of herself and one other person, and she has an enormous job. And that is to try and teach Japanese children, as many as she could reach, most of whom have never ever heard of the Holocaust, about the Nazi plan to exterminate all the Jews of Europe. And Fumiko's a very smart woman, and so she decided that the best way for kids to begin to connect to a story as overwhelming as this one might be through objects. So she got a loan from the museum at Auschwitz, which was the biggest Nazi concentration camp, of 5 objects that had been connected to children. She got a child's sock, a shoe, a sweater, an empty canister of Zyklon B poison gas, which was the gas used to kill people in the gas chambers, and she got the suitcase, which, as you saw, had just a few words on it: Hana's name, her birth date, and the word Waisenkind, which is the German word for orphan. And as soon as the suitcase arrived at the center, Fumiko and the kids who had formed a group called Small Wings, these were the regulars who came to the center, Fumiko and the Small Wings were drawn to it like a magnet because it was the only object that they had received that had a name on it. And the kids were full of questions. Who was this girl? What did she put in her suitcase? Where did she go with it? What happened to her? And Fumiko had no answers. All she had was what was written on the suitcase. So she contacted the museum at Auschwitz, who got back to her and said, "We know nothing more about the owner of this suitcase." She wrote to Holocaust museums all over the world and got the same answer from all of them. "We know nothing about a girl named Hana Brady." And then out of the blue, she received a second letter from Auschwitz saying they did know one thing, and that was that Hana had come to Auschwitz from a place called Theresienstadt, or Terezin. So Fumiko set out to learn absolutely everything she could about that place. Now, Theresienstadt was another place where Jews were imprisoned by the Nazis. It wasn't a death camp like, say, Auschwitz or Buchenwald, though it's really important to remember that 38,000 people died in Theresienstadt during the war, mostly of starvation and disease. But this was a place where Jews were held before, and sometimes for quite long periods of time, before they were sent off to the big death camps in the East. But in her research, Fumiko learned that the children at Theresienstadt, many of them, had participated in a secret underground art school that was run by writers and artists and musicians who were also prisoners there, and that over 4,000 of the children's drawings had survived the war. So she contacted the Terezin Ghetto Museum. They put her on to the Jewish Museum in Prague, where those drawings are now kept. And a few weeks after that, she and the kids received copies of 5 drawings by Hana Brady. They were ecstatic to get these drawings. This one is, as you can see, just pencil. There are a couple of the other ones which actually have colored pencil. This is probably one of the later ones because as the war went on, they had fewer and fewer supplies to do drawing, but we don't know an actual date on this. But they were thrilled to get these drawings because this was their first connection beyond the suitcase to Hana. And so Fumiko encouraged some of the littler kids in Small Wings to make their own drawings of how they imagined Hana. And that's one of the Japanese kids' drawings. And the little figure on the cloud that looks a bit chickenish is actually Hana, imagined as an angel by one of the Japanese children. And this, of course, just made them want to know more. More than anything, of course, they wanted to know what had happened to Hana, but they also really wanted to know what she looked like. They wanted to put a face to this girl whose story they were searching for. So Fumiko wrote again to the Terezin Museum, got the same answer, "We can't help you." But Fumiko is one of the most persistent people I have ever met. She just does not give up. And so she decided to go to Terezin herself and see if she could find anything out that way. So after going to a conference in England, she flew to Prague and took a bus to the modern-day town of Terezin. She only had 24 hours before she had to get back on a plane to Japan. But when she went into the museum, it was empty. She couldn't figure out what was going on because the door was open, but there was nobody there, no staff. She went out to the square, and a man explained to her that it was holiday time in Terezin. There wasn't going to be anybody who could help her now. She'd have to come back another day, which of course she didn't have. She was furious with herself for not having made a prior arrangement, and she was just sick at the thought of going back to Japan, seeing the small wings empty-handed with no new information about Hana. So before she got back on a bus to Prague, she decided to poke her nose in one more time. And that time she did hear a rustling in a back office. She found a woman there who also said, "It's holiday time, go away, can't help you." But when she explained what she was doing and how little time she had, this woman, whose name was Ludmila, agreed to help her out. So the two of them went through many, many books of names until they found Hana's name on a list. And that is the list. This is a transport list. The Nazis kept very, very careful records of all the awful things they did. Hana's name is fourth from the bottom, and it has a check mark beside it. Every name on this list has a check mark beside it, and that check mark means that the person is dead. There's one name that doesn't have a check mark beside it, and that's the name just above Hana's, which is now in a box, and that is the name George Brady. So Fumiko noticed this other Brady, this Brady without a check mark, immediately, and she said to Ludmila, "Could this be Hana's brother?" And Ludmila said she had no idea, but she also warned Fumiko not to get too excited because the list was old. George could be anywhere in the world. He could very easily have changed his name, and he could just as easily be dead. But Fumiko begged her to press on and see if they could find out anything more about this Brady without a check mark. So they went through more books of names, and they did find George's name on another list, a list from the boys' home in Theresienstadt, room 1. And on that list of boys, where the names were clumped in groups by bunk, there was George's name, and right beside his, another name, Kurt Kotoch. And Ludmila, in an amazing coincidence, recognized that second name and said, "I know that guy is alive, and he lives somewhere in Prague, and if you can find him, maybe he can tell you what happened to this other Brady without a check mark." So Fumiko raced back to Prague, raced to the Jewish Museum, found someone there who agreed to help her, who was able to track down Mr. Kotoch, whose secretary said, "Sorry, he can't see you and he can't speak to you. He's off to a big international meeting." And at that point, with very little time left, there were some tears, and finally Mr. Kotoch relented, and he came to see Fumiko at the Jewish Museum for half an hour, and it was there that he told her that his old bunkmate from concentration camp, George Brady, was alive and well and living in Toronto, Canada, and he gave Fumiko George's address. So Fumiko returned to Japan, gave the good news to the small wings, and spent a couple of weeks, actually, crafting a very, very careful letter to George. And that letter, along with drawings and poems from the kids in Japan, arrived in August of 2000 at George's home in Toronto. George was the only member of his immediate family to survive the Holocaust. He actually tried to come as an immigrant to this country, but couldn't get in. And then in 1951, he managed to track down a brother of his grandfather in Toronto, a man he had never met, and that man agreed to sponsor him to come to Canada. So he did. And he built a very good life for himself in Canada. He had a prosperous business and he had 4 great kids. And he prided himself on living life fully and living it in the present and the future. But there was one piece of his own history that he just couldn't come to terms with, and that was what had happened to his sister. Because he was the big brother, he was supposed to take care of her, bring her home safely, and he couldn't do it. And so all his adult life, George Brady had terrible, terrible nightmares. And then, more than half a century after his sister died, and completely out of the blue, comes a package from Japan. So I'm just going to stop here for a few minutes and let you hear the voices of George and Fumiko and let them pick up the story. So could we have the audio, please?
Suddenly, I got a letter from Japan, a big envelope. I was wondering who would write to me from Japan, and when I opened it, I couldn't believe it. I just was stunned, I just couldn't believe it. It's to the credit and incredible perseverance of Fumiko that she decided to find who the owner was, and she went through a lot of problems and challenges to find it, but she did manage.
Right after I went home, I wrote to Mr. Brady, but still at that time I wasn't sure if I could get any response from him. This might remind him of bitter memories, and he might not want to hear such a thing anymore. But a few weeks later, I got a nice letter from him and details about Hana, and also this beautiful photos of Hana. And I just screamed at that time, and my hands were shaking, and as I read the letter. But the thing is that I was, of course, really excited to finally find Hana and find out what kind of girl she was when she was in Happy Days, and what she liked to do. She went skiing, skating, and a lot of details on Hana. It was unbelievable. But what really excited me is that Hana's brother survived. And he now has such a beautiful family. I was so happy about that. In Japan, the Holocaust is so far away. It's such a, some people don't see any connection whatsoever. But when they look at the suitcase, these children were really shocked that she was my age. And that really helped them a lot to really focus on this one little life that was lost. And they could really relate her to themselves and really try to think about why such a thing happened to a girl like her, and why Jewish people, and why children. They then realized that there were 1.5 million children like Hana.
So that is the photograph that fell out of the envelope that made Fumiko scream. And that was the first photograph she and the kids saw of Hana. And that's the photograph that's now on the cover of the American edition of the book and the Canadian edition of the book. So once that initial contact was made, much more followed, and George shared lots of memories of Hana, lots of photographs of Hana with Fumiko and the kids. And I just want to show you some of those beautiful photographs on the big screen. They've made such an enormous difference in helping this story come alive to kids around the world. The story of the Holocaust is a pretty overwhelming one, and the idea of 6 million is hard to picture in your mind. But when you have the face of one girl, or one person, or one child, it's a way for us to begin to connect to something that's very tough. So we are very lucky to have a lot of photographs, beautiful ones, of Hana. So she was born May 16, 1931, in Novo Miesto in the province of Moravia, in the cross-country skiing capital of Czechoslovakia. And the family lived on the main square in town, and her parents ran a general store there. They were a pretty happy family, and Hana was a very sort of happy-go-lucky kid. And that's the photograph that's on the front cover of the Australian edition of the book. Every country chooses its own cover. That is Hana and George with their wolfhound, whose name was Silva, who was a very loyal friend to Hana and George when they didn't have a lot of friends. The Brady parents were athletic people, and they were also artistic people, and so were both the kids. All right, this is a small enough space that I can ask my question. This is Hana in a school play. Anybody want to guess what she's playing here? Yes. Tomato? No? Good guess. Who's that? An Oompa Loompa. No, that is a new one on me. No. I don't think they had Oompa Loompas in Novo Miesto, but yes. A flower? No. Pardon? A swimmer? No. Last one. A raindrop. That's a good one too. No, she's actually playing a rooster. This stuff that's under her neck is meant to be rooster-like. But good tries and new ideas here. That is Hana skating in a red velvet skating outfit that she loved a lot, and in a white fur trim. Hana and George skiing and building snow forts with their friends. Now, Hana and George were the only two Jewish kids in the whole town of Novo Miesto. And until the Nazis invaded, it wasn't an issue for them, and it wasn't an issue for anybody else. But as soon as the Nazis came, things got ugly really, really quickly. There were new restrictions announced against Jews every time they turned around. They couldn't own radios, they couldn't own bicycles, they couldn't go out after a certain hour, they couldn't travel anywhere, they couldn't go to movie theaters, they couldn't go to parks, then playgrounds. And finally, the kids were told they couldn't go to school anymore. Now, in case anyone here has the idea that that might be a cool thing, George always reminds everyone that this was the most painful restriction of all for them, because not only they couldn't learn, which was hard, not only were they stuck at home, which was hard, but they lost all their friends. So it was a very lonely time. Their parents hired tutors to teach them at home, but in March 1941, Mother was arrested by the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, and taken to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. She managed to get one letter out while she was there. This was very early in the war still. And inside she enclosed homemade charms that she had made of chewed up bread. And she used toothpaste to write the initials of a family member onto each one. And George still has those charms. And I'm sure you can imagine, or maybe not, how precious they are to him. That fall, all Jews were ordered to wear a yellow star whenever they left the house, which the kids really hated. And so it meant they went out less and less. And then one day, one Jewish guy in town just couldn't take it anymore. and he refused to wear his star in the way he'd been ordered. And for his insolence, all Jewish men in town were immediately arrested, and that included Hana and George's dad, which meant that now they had no parents. I am sure, I would bet, that every single person in this room, students, teachers, parents, visitors, me included, have had the experience on the street, at a shopping mall, at school, in a community group, of turning a blind eye when somebody is treated badly just for who they are. I'm sure you've thought, I've thought, what can I do about it? Or it's not my problem. Well, all over Europe, while their Jewish friends and neighbors were being arrested and persecuted and deported and beaten and killed, almost everyone stood by and did absolutely nothing at all. But there were a few people who were very brave and very decent, and from whom we all have to learn, who were willing to stick their necks out and try and do the right thing. And one of those people was Hana and George's uncle Ludwig, who was a Christian. He wasn't a target of the Nazis at that time. And as soon as father was arrested, he and his wife Hedda, at risk to themselves, took the kids into their home. And that is Hana and Uncle Ludwig, and Hana and George in their aunt and uncle's backyard. Then in April 1942, George and Hana were ordered deported to Theresienstadt. And that is the deportation order that was served on Hannah Brady, which meant that she had her 11th birthday on her way to a concentration camp. And the kids lived in Theresienstadt for the next 2.5 years. Then in 1944, when the Nazis started to realize they might be losing the war, they decided to speed up deportations to the big death camps in the east. George was 16 by then, and he was sent first. Hana, on October 23rd, 1944, on the second to last transport out of Theresienstadt, was sent to Auschwitz. And because she was judged to be too young to work, she was killed right away. Again, remember, there were 1.5 million children like Hana, most of whom we'll never know about. In fact, if it weren't for Fumiko's persistence and hard work, Hana would really only live in George's memory. But because of what she did, and because of George's courage also in sharing his story, we can know Hana and honor her in a very unusual way. And this girl who always dreamed of being a teacher has been able to become one half a century after she died. In March 2001, George and his daughter Lara Hana traveled to Tokyo to meet the small wings. And I don't know if you can see that very well, but Lara's the redhead, the only redhead in the picture. And those are the small wings, and their placards read, "Let's learn, think, and act to create peace in the 21st century." So this is a story where we learn about the worst in human beings, in what the Nazis did to Hana and to so many other children and adults. But we also learn about the very best in people, how these great kids and that great young woman halfway around the world are working away against anti-Semitism and racism and intolerance of all kinds, and in a way on Hana's behalf. Now, the story of Hana's Suitcase did not end with the publication of the book. There have been a few surprises since. The first one came about 2 years after the publication of the book. George and Fumiko, on a trip to Europe, learned that Hana's suitcase, the original Hana's suitcase, the one that she actually carried from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, was burned and destroyed in a fire in Birmingham, England in 1984. It was there as part of the very first ever traveling exhibit from the museum at Auschwitz. The police in Birmingham, England think that it was probably a fire deliberately set, arson, and probably set by neo-Nazis. These are people who still believe in Hitler's cause and want the rest of us to believe that the Holocaust never happened. The museum at Auschwitz created a replica from a photograph of the original suitcase, and it was a replica that was sent to Tokyo. But because of a clerical error in the loan agreement between Auschwitz and the museum in Tokyo, nobody knew that. And finding it all out was another somewhat heart-stopping mystery, which is now also solved. And in the end, even though it was quite surprising when we first found it out, in the end we're all so grateful that Auschwitz created that replica, because if it hadn't, Fumiko would have never searched for Hana and never found George, and we would never have the story of Hana's suitcase. Another great surprise is that George's nightmares have ended. He is truly thrilled and gratified that so many kids in so many countries are so interested in his sister's story. And he really feels like her little life has enormous meaning now. And the last one came a couple of years ago, and this is a truly amazing story. It started on a night, a snowy night, in December of 2004, when a young man was walking along a street in Brno, which is the second largest city in the Czech Republic. And he walked by a dumpster. And on top of the dumpster, he saw a bunch of kind of antique-looking children's books. And he decided to pick them up because his mom is a professor of children's literature at the university there. So he picked up these books, and under the books there were some papers, and under the papers there were some albums. So he took as much as his arms could carry, and it was pretty soggy, took it all home to try and figure out what it was, laid it all out, and he and his mom, dried it and organized it as best they could, and they realized there was some connection to the Second World War and some connection probably to Theresienstadt, but they weren't sure what. And then a few weeks later, his mom was reading a book review of the Czech edition of Hana's Suitcase. And she decided to go look at the stuff from the dumpster one more time and see if there was any connection. And there was. There were all of Hana and George's report cards from school. There were letters that Hana had written to her mother when she was in concentration camp that had been returned because there were too many lines in them, broken regulations. There was a handwritten magazine from the girls' room in Theresienstadt in which Hana is mentioned 4 times. And there were 3 notebooks of a diary that George wrote from the day he arrived at Theresienstadt till the day he left for Auschwitz, which he didn't even remember keeping until all this material was returned to him, which happened about 6 or 8 months after this discovery. So this story continues. The Suitcase and an exhibition about Hana are traveling constantly all over Japan with Fumiko. As you heard, the book is being published in 45 countries. There's a play, there's 2 films. It is very exciting and gratifying for all of us. I wish you could meet George. He turned 80 earlier this year, and I was at his 80th birthday party, for which he dyed his hair blue, which will give you an idea of the kind of guy George is. He's, despite everything he's gone through, he's in many ways very funny and optimistic. And he still skis, and he's a real tough nut to beat on a tennis court. And as I say, very gratified by the interest in his sister's story. And Fumiko is also an amazing person, and not just for all the work she did to discover the story of Hana. She really does believe, and this is the whole idea behind Small Wings, that kids have both an opportunity and a responsibility to make the world a better place. So if you take anything away from the story of Hana's Suitcase, let it be that you figure out what you can do at school, at home, in any clubs you belong to, any groups you belong to, or just in your everyday life, what you can do. It can be very, very small or very big, to make the world a more just and tolerant place. And I'm going to end by playing you a song by some grade 8 students in north of Toronto in a public school who did something that made a difference. They wrote a song with the help of a music consultant. They recorded it in a professional studio, and I have played this song all over the world, and I think it's truly remarkable. So here's the song. We hope.
I read a story about a young girl, a true story that changed my world. So many questions still in my mind, with answers I must find. A few pictures give me clues, a few faces that she once knew, a few memories that she embraced in Hannah's brown suitcase. Just a small child in a small checked out, but such a strong child when her world came down. But Hannah's dreams fell like a setting sun in 1941. A few pictures give me clues, a few faces that she once knew, a few memories that she embraced in Hannah's brown suitcase.
the same time as Hannah Brady was in Theresienstadt, Annalisa Salomon was in Theresienstadt. And we are honored and privileged to be able to live in a time when we can still hear the stories of Holocaust survivors, and lucky that we have Annalisa Salomon with us today. So she's just going to speak for a couple of minutes about her experience, and it's very worth hearing about.
I would like once more to thank Mr. Peterson and the Jackson Center to bring me here and give me the honor to talk to you. I am 1 year older than Hana was, and I was in Theresienstadt from May 42 to May 45. My past is very, very much the same as Hana's. I grew up in a small town in Moravia. My parents were taken by Gestapo also a year before my 5-year older brother and me went to Theresienstadt. Where is the difference is that I survived with a lot of guilt feeling. How comes it me? I don't think that's a question which will be ever answered. Maybe to a point it helped. Then my 5-year older brother, at the time when we couldn't go to school, my parents bribed a local gardener, and my brother learned the trade of gardening. And as we arrived to Theresienstadt, he was sent to work as a slave laborer at the farm. It was a German industrial farm. He did find out that if you work in the field of potatoes, carrots, whatever, and you did steal it, and were not caught, which brought up beating, sometimes sending to east, he, through his overseer, lied about my age, and I was assigned to work there too, which did help me in a way that when I was chosen or directed to go east, each time I was taken out of the transport because they needed people to work. It didn't help my brother, and he was sent in spring of 1944 to Theresienstadt, to Auschwitz. He was gassed and burned like majority of the Jewish people. I am the only survivor from a big family on both sides. In 1945, our camp was liberated by the Russians. I was sent to a place to recover, being deloused, clean, fed, and through Red Cross, I know how many times I removed cousin of my mother, who was married to a not Jewish man, survived, and they find out through Red Cross that I am alive, and he was appointed my guardian. They did find me and took me back to that small town where I am from. I went back to school. They wanted me to catch up as much as I could of 6 years not going to school. I did. In the first year, got 4 years, make my exam entrance or written to high school. So I graduated at 20 from high school, went to college. I found a husband who was a survivor in Prague, a survivor as me. We got married. We had 2 children, and we lived in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, which was a communist country. It was not too much of a pleasure just the opposite, to live as a Jew in a country behind the Iron Curtain, because the anti-Semitism was really very much alive. In 1968, when the Russian military marched in Czechoslovakia, my husband said, and that's it, to totalitarian regimes, and we have two daughters, they were 9 and 11, let's try to get out from here. We tried twice to get across the borders, we didn't make it. For the third time, we were lucky, we made it. We were in Vienna, the capital of Austria, for 3 months. We were waiting for get our papers, working permit to United States. We came. It was my husband's, besides marrying me, the best decision in his life. To take us to the United States. We lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And when my husband passed away 3 years ago, I moved to Naples, Florida, and I have both daughters living in Florida, 4 grandchildren. And besides not having my husband anymore, live ever happy after. And I cannot tell you how thankful I am to be in United States. There are 2 things where I would like to get your attention. The first is, please, you are the last generation who has the privilege to see, not me, but to be aware that there are still few survivors, liberators, or hidden children still alive. So please, it's up to you, to your children and all the generation, to say it's true, the Holocaust was. And please be nice to each other, don't be judgmental, and be tolerant. And don't take the life in the United States for granted. It's the best country in the whole world. Please be good and try to live your life that you will be able to prevent anything like that happen again. Thank you very much.
Wow. Mark this day, folks. This is an extraordinary opportunity to listen to an extraordinary author who presented us an extraordinary book, Hana's Suitcase, and an extraordinary opportunity to listen to someone who actually lived the life that was depicted in the book Hana's Suitcase in the form of Annalise Salomon. This is not easy for Annalise Salomon to do what she just did. And please mark the words she said them. She said them so plainly, and please do not forget. Always remember that which occurred so that it may not be repeated again. To Karen Levine, what a wonderful 2 days this has been. On behalf of the Robert Jackson Center and all the folks who were involved in this, I want to thank you for making an extraordinary effort and to really impart something really special to an awful lot of people. Thank you, Karen. And to Annalise, who was able to work in this opportunity to come to the Jackson Center, who, having read your book, she wanted to meet you, Karen, and to be part of this program. As she'll be leaving here shortly and will will be going to attend the announcement of her grandson's induction into the Naval Academy, which congratulations on that. That's terrific. Time will not permit us to do Q&A, which many of you submitted questions. However, Karen has agreed that she will take these questions. She will answer them. They will be part of our website, and we will make sure they're emailed off to the teachers as well. Also, as we depart, we're going to keep the Washington folks in place because some of them are downstairs, and Karen will be leaving in a few seconds with Anita to go downstairs and just make sure they have a chance to greet you in person downstairs. So if you would do that, that would be terrific. And then I believe the order of sequence, the Bemis Point folks will be leaving shortly thereafter. And there are a few folks who will be joining you, Anita. The Anderson? Amy Anderson students, if you could leave also first thing and follow Anita Sanctuary, because this doesn't happen without Anita Sanctuary. And it's just, I want to, again, publicly thank Anita for, once again, raising the bar on this opportunity for this entire... So on behalf of the Jackson Center, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Karen, Annalise once again, and we'll see you next year.
I hope you fell all over the place.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
This was magic.
We gotta get you out of here.